Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. The desert floor is still warm from the afternoon sun, but the woman lying face down in the sand has stopped feeling temperature altogether. The year is 1851, March 14th. Somewhere in what is now Arizona territory, the wagon train that was supposed to carry the Oatman family safely to California lies in shattered silence, its remains scattered across nearly a quarter-mile of open ground. Her name is Mary Ann Oatman. She is 17 years old. Until roughly 2 hours ago, she was traveling beside her parents, 4 brothers, and 2 sisters, chasing the promise of a new life in the fertile lands of the Pacific coast. That promise is now dead. Her parents are dead. She watched her father's skull collapse beneath a war club as he tried desperately to negotiate for his family's lives. She saw her mother fall beside him, struck down without mercy. She heard her younger siblings scatter, screaming, as armed warriors moved through the camp with calm, practiced violence. Mary Ann was struck as well. She can feel blood tangled in her hair where the blow landed. Somehow, impossibly, she is still alive, still conscious, still aware. But she cannot move. She cannot speak. She can only lie in the sand and listen. She hears the warriors gathering the survivors. She hears the voices of her sisters, Olive, 15, and little Mary Ann, just 7, crying somewhere nearby. She hears her brother Lorenzo groaning in the distance. Not dead, but wounded badly enough that the attackers have already decided he is not worth taking. She hears the sounds of possessions being sorted, the wagon stripped of anything useful, the methodical efficiency of people who have done this many times before. Mary Ann does not yet understand that she will die here, bleeding into the sand, from wounds deemed too severe to treat. She does not yet understand that her sisters will be taken alive, beginning a journey into captivity that will last years. A journey that will reshape them so completely their own family would no longer recognize who they became. A journey that will end for one sister in death, and for the other in a return to white society so traumatic that the rest of her life will be spent trying to reconcile who she was with who captivity forced her to become. What Mary Ann Oatman does understand, in her final hours of consciousness, is that everything her family believed about the journey west was wrong. They believed they were traveling through empty land toward opportunity. In reality, they were crossing the homeland of peoples who had lived there for centuries. Peoples fighting a brutal war for survival against the relentless expansion of settlers into their territory. Peoples who had developed specific, deeply ingrained practices for dealing with captives. Practices the Oatman family could never have imagined. The Tonto Apache warriors who attacked the Oatman wagon train were not acting randomly. They were following cultural patterns refined over generations. Patterns for raiding. Patterns for choosing captives. Patterns for testing those captives through experiences that would determine whether they lived or died, whether they were adopted into Apache society or traded to other tribes, whether they would remain permanent outsiders or, in some transformed and painful sense, become Apache themselves. What happened to Olive and Mary Ann Oatman in the years that followed, and what happened to hundreds of other women taken captive during the Apache Wars of the 19th century, is the story we uncover here at Crimson Legacy Historians. This is not the romanticized captivity of frontier myth. This is not the simple, comfortable story of savage attackers and innocent settlers. This is the documented reality of what captive women experience the selection process. The breaking period, the transformation that Apache captivity was designed to produce. It is brutal, it is systematic, and it is recorded in sources ranging from captivity narratives, written by survivors, to military reports, to anthropological studies of Apache culture conducted before traditional practices were lost. This is what the Apache did to their captives. This is what the sources document. This is what you were never taught. What you are about to learn has been sanitized, romanticized, and distorted in most accounts of the American frontier. You know about the Apache Wars in general terms. You have heard of Geronimo and Cuchis, of the military campaigns that eventually confined the Apache peoples to reservations, of the conflict between expanding American settlement and indigenous resistance. You may have encountered captivity narratives in literature classes, presented as a genre of frontier writing without much attention to the actual experiences they describe. But you have never learned what captivity actually involved. You have never heard about the specific stages through which Apache captives were processed. The initial selection that determined who lived and who died. The breaking period that destroyed previous identity. The integration protocols that transformed survivors into functional members of Apache society, or prepared them for trade to other peoples. You have never encountered the detailed accounts that survivors left of practices that they struggled to describe in language their audiences could understand. Tonight, you will discover what the historical sources reveal about Apache captivity in the 19th century. You will learn about the cultural logic that governed captive taking, not random cruelty, but structured practice serving specific purposes within Apache society. You will learn about the stages of captivity that survivors describe with remarkable consistency across different times and circumstances. You will learn about the physical and psychological techniques that transformed captives into something other than what they had been. You will learn about Olive Oatman, who was 15 years old when she was captured and who spent 5 years in captivity before being ransomed back to white society. Her face marked with the tattoos that identified her as a captive and that she would carry for the rest of her life. About Sarah Ann Horn, who was captured in Texas and who left one of the most detailed accounts of the early stages of Apache captivity. About Lena Pennington Page, who was captured in 1860 and whose story reveals the specific practices used to break resistant captives. About the unnamed women documented in military records, whose fates can be reconstructed from fragments that soldiers and officials recorded. You will learn these things from primary sources, from the captivity narratives that survivors wrote or dictated, from military and government records, from anthropological studies conducted when Apache elders still remembered traditional practices, from archaeological evidence that confirms what written sources describe. The reality of Apache captivity is documented in sources that have been available to scholars for over a century, but that popular understanding continues to ignore. Subscribe if you want to understand what the American frontier actually looked like for those who experienced it as captives rather than as settlers or soldiers. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, because Marianne Oatman is lying in the Arizona sand taking her final breaths, and her sisters are being gathered with the other survivors. And I am going to tell you exactly what happened next, what the sources document, what the captives experienced, and what the evidence reveals about practices that shaped the lives of hundreds of women across decades of frontier conflict. But first, I need to explain the cultural context that made Apache captivity different from what most people imagine. The Apache peoples, a term covering multiple distinct groups, including the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Western Apache, Lipan Jicarilla, and others, had practiced captive taking for centuries before European contact. Captives served multiple functions within Apache society, and understanding these functions is essential for understanding what captives experienced. The first function was demographic replacement. Apache warfare, like warfare among many indigenous peoples, produced casualties that threatened community survival. Captives, particularly women and children who could be integrated into Apache bands, helped offset these losses. A woman who was successfully transformed into an Apache wife and mother contributed to the community's future in ways that simply killing her would not. The second function was labor. Apache economy depended on work that captives could perform, processing hides, gathering food, maintaining camps, caring for children. A captive who proved capable and compliant could become a valuable economic asset, contributing labor that freed Apache women and men for other activities. The third function was trade. Captives were valuable commodities in the extensive trade networks that connected different indigenous peoples across the Southwest. A captive taken by Apache raiders might be traded to Comanche, Navajo, or other peoples exchanged for horses, weapons, or other goods that the Apache valued. This trade function meant that captives' fates were not always determined by their Apache captives. They might pass through multiple owners and multiple cultures during their captivity. The fourth function was revenge and psychological warfare. Captive taking terrorized enemy populations in ways that simple killing could not. The knowledge that capture meant not quick death, but prolonged captivity, with all that captivity involved, made frontier settlements fear Apache raids in ways that shaped settlement patterns, military deployments, and political decisions. Captives were weapons of psychological warfare, as well as economic assets. The fifth function was ritual and status. The taking of captives demonstrated warrior prowess in ways that enhanced status within Apache society. A warrior who returned from a raid with captives had proven his skill and courage. The treatment of those captives, whether harsh or lenient, reflected the warrior's status and his band's circumstances. These functions shaped every aspect of how captives were treated. The selection process determined which captives served which functions. The breaking process prepared captives for their assigned roles. The integration or trade processes completed the transformation from enemy outsider to economic asset. Nothing in the system was random, even when it appeared chaotic to captives, who did not understand the cultural logic governing their treatment. The Oatman family stumbled into this system without understanding any of it. They were traveling through Apache territory during a period of intensifying conflict between Apache peoples and American settlers. They were poorly armed, poorly informed, and traveling in a group too small to defend itself effectively. When Tanto Apache warriors encountered them, the family represented an opportunity for plunder, for captives, for sending a message to other settlers about the costs of entering Apache territory. The attack followed patterns that Apache raiders had refined over generations. The warriors assessed the target, identified its vulnerabilities, struck with overwhelming force at the optimal moment, and efficiently processed the aftermath, killing those not worth taking, selecting captives based on established criteria, gathering plunder, and withdrawing before any response could be organized. Olive and Mary Ann Oatman were selected because they met the criteria for valuable captives. They were female, which meant they could potentially be integrated into Apache society, or traded at higher prices than male captives. They were young enough to be transformed through the captivity process, but old enough to perform useful labor. They were healthy enough to survive the journey that would follow. They were valuable. Their parents and brothers were killed because they did not meet these criteria. Adult men were dangerous. They might resist, might attempt escape, might cause problems that exceeded their value. The younger children were too young to survive the rigors of captive transport. The wounded, like Marianne, were not worth the resources required to keep them alive. The selection was brutal, but logical within the framework that governed Apache captive taking. What followed for Olive and Marianne would be governed by this same logic, not random cruelty, but systematic processing designed to achieve specific outcomes. The first stage of Apache captivity was the taking itself, the initial capture, and the immediate aftermath that determined whether captives would survive long enough to enter the processing that followed. For Olive and Marianne Oatman, the taking happened on March 14, 1851. The attack lasted perhaps 30 minutes. Their parents and 4 siblings were killed. They were seized, bound, and forced to march away from the site before any help could arrive. Not that any help was coming given the isolation of the attack site. The journey that followed was designed to test captives immediately. Apache raiders traveled fast, covering ground at speeds that exhausted even conditioned warriors. Captives who could not keep pace were killed or abandoned. Captives who complained, who tried to slow the group, who showed signs of being more trouble than they were worth, were eliminated. The journey was the first selection filter. Only captives with the physical capacity and psychological resilience to survive brutal travel conditions would reach the next stage. Olive later described this initial journey in her captivity narrative. We were driven at a pace that seemed impossible to maintain. My feet bled, my body ached from the blows that accompanied any hesitation. My sister was so small, so young, and yet she was expected to keep the same pace as the warriors with the same consequences for failure. I carried her when I could. I encouraged her when I could not carry her. I understood without being told that if she fell behind, we would both die. The physical demands were only part of the initial testing. Captives were also being evaluated for psychological responses. Did they fight back? Did they attempt escape? Did they cooperate sufficiently to be manageable? Did they show the kind of resilience that suggested they might survive the full captivity process? Warriors observed captive behavior constantly during the initial journey, forming assessments that would influence how captives were treated in subsequent stages. The journey from the attack site to the initial Apache camp took approximately 4 days. During this time, the Oatman sisters received minimal food, minimal water, and minimal rest. They were bound at night to prevent escape. They were struck for any behavior that annoyed their captors. They were stripped of their remaining American clothing and given minimal garments more suited to desert travel. By the time they reached the Apache camp, they had already been transformed from members of a settler family into captives whose survival depended entirely on their ability to meet Apache expectations. The breaking had already begun. When captives reached Apache camps, they entered an assessment period during which their fate would be determined. This assessment was not a single event, but an ongoing process lasting days or weeks, during which captives were evaluated, assigned preliminary status, and began learning what would be expected of them. For the Oatman sisters, assessment began immediately upon arrival at the Tanto Apache camp. They were presented to the band's leadership, displayed to the community, and subjected to evaluation that combined physical examination with behavioral testing. The physical examination assessed their health, their capacity for labor, their physical characteristics that might affect their value in trade or integration. Olive was 15, approaching the age when she might be considered marriageable. Marianne was 7, young enough that she might be successfully raised as Apache, if the band chose to keep her. Both were examined for injuries from the journey, for diseases that might spread to the community, for physical capabilities that would determine what work they could perform. The behavioral testing assessed their psychological state and their likely responses to captivity. Were they docile or resistant? Did they follow commands? Did they show intelligence that might make them useful or dangerous? Did they form bonds with each other or with their captors in ways that might be exploited? Warriors and women alike observed the sisters constantly, forming judgments that would determine their treatment. The assessment period for the Oatman sisters lasted approximately 1 year. During this time they were kept as slaves in the Tanto Apache camp, performing labor under conditions that the assessment process used to evaluate their capabilities and compliance. Olive described the work expected of captives. We gathered food, roots, berries, seeds, anything edible that the desert provided. We processed hides, scraping and treating them under the direction of Apache women, who showed us nothing but contempt. We hauled water, gathered firewood, maintained the camp in whatever ways we were directed. We worked from first light until darkness with barely enough food to sustain the labor required of us. The labor itself was testing. Could the captives perform the work required? Could they learn the skills needed? Could they function under conditions of minimal food and maximal demand? Captives who failed these tests, who could not learn, could not work, could not survive. The conditions did not advance to the next stage. They were killed or allowed to die or traded at reduced prices to peoples who might find use for less capable slaves. The Oatman sisters passed these tests. They learned, they worked, they survived, and approximately 1 year after their capture, their fate was determined. They were to be traded. The Tanto Apache traded the Oatman sisters to the Mojave people approximately 1 year after the initial capture. This trade was not unusual. Captives frequently passed through multiple owners during their captivity. Their fates determined by economic calculations, rather than personal relationships. The trade journey took several days, crossing desert terrain to reach Mojave territory along the Colorado River. The sisters were transferred like any other trade goods, their value assessed. A price negotiated, ownership transferred to their new captors. The Mojave were culturally distinct from the Apache with different languages, different customs, different approaches to captive treatment. The sisters were entering a new cultural system, one that would shape their experience for the next 4 years. What happened to the sisters in Mojave captivity diverged. Both were tattooed on their chins with the distinctive marks that Mojave people used. Marks that would identify them as Mojave, affiliated for the rest of their lives. Both were assigned to Mojave families who would be responsible for their maintenance and supervision. But their experiences within this system differed based on their ages, their responses, and circumstances beyond their control. Marianne was young enough that the Mojave apparently attempted genuine adoption. She was placed with a family that treated her by some accounts more like a daughter than a slave. She learned the language. She participated in community life. She began the transformation that might have eventually made her Mojave in all but blood origin. Olive was older, past the age when full adoption was typical, but young enough that she occupied an ambiguous status. Not quite slave, not quite family, something in between that the Mojave social system could accommodate, but that all of herself found disorienting. She described her position. I was told I was a daughter of the chief's family. I was given food when food was available, shelter when shelter was available, but I was also marked as different. The tattoos on my face proclaimed my status as someone who had been taken, who had been transformed, who would never be fully one of them, regardless of how long I lived among them. I belonged, and I did not belong. I was family, and I was property. The contradiction never resolved. The 4 years that Olive spent with the Mojave included periods of relative comfort and periods of severe hardship. When food was plentiful, captives ate. When famine struck, as it did in 1855, killing many Mojave, including Marion captives, suffered disproportionately. Marion died during this famine at approximately 11 years of age, her body unable to survive the deprivation that the community experienced. Olive survived. She survived because she was older, stronger, more capable of enduring deprivation. She survived because she had learned to navigate Mojave society well enough to access whatever resources were available. She survived because the randomness of famine took her sister instead of her. By the time American authorities learned of her existence and negotiated her release in 1856, Olive had spent 5 years in captivity. She was 20 years old. She had been transformed in ways that neither she nor her rescuers fully understood. Let me now describe in detail what the sources reveal about the breaking process that Apache and related peoples used on captives, the systematic techniques designed to destroy previous identity and create compliance. The process began immediately upon capture and continued through the entire period of captivity, though it was most intensive during the first weeks and months. The techniques used were consistent across different Apache groups and across different time periods, suggesting established practices transmitted across generations. The first technique was physical exhaustion. Captives were worked to the limits of their endurance, given minimal food and water, denied adequate rest. This exhaustion served multiple purposes. It prevented escape attempts, it reduced psychological resistance, and it began teaching captives that their survival depended on meeting their captors' demands. Sarah Ann Horn, captured in Texas in 1836, described the exhaustion. They kept us moving constantly. When we stopped, we worked. When we worked, we were watched. When we rested, we were bound. There was never a moment when we could gather our thoughts, plan our escape, consider our situation clearly. We were too tired to think. We were too hungry to plan. We existed from moment to moment, focused only on surviving until the next moment. The second technique was isolation. Captives were separated from each other when possible, prevented from communicating in their native languages, cut off from any source of support or validation for their previous identities. This isolation created psychological dependency on captors. The only humans available for interaction were the people who had taken them. The third technique was identity destruction. Captives' names were replaced. Their clothing was replaced. Their hair was often cut or styled according to Apache customs. Every visible marker of their previous identity was removed and replaced with markers indicating their new status. They were forbidden to speak their native languages. They were punished for any behavior that indicated they still considered themselves members of their original culture. Larsina Pennington Page, captured in 1860, described the identity destruction. They took my name first. I was not Larsina anymore. I was a word in their language that meant the white woman or sometimes the slave, chorch. When I used my own name, when I spoke English, when I tried to pray in the ways my mother taught me, I was beaten. I learned to answer to what they called me. I learned to speak their words. I learned to keep my prayers silent inside my head, where they could not hear them. The fourth technique was violence calibrated to produce compliance, without permanent damage. Captives were beaten for resistance, for slow compliance, for any behavior that displeased their captives. But the violence was typically calculated severe enough to cause pain and fear, not severe enough to kill or permanently disable a valuable captive. The goal was submission, not destruction. The fifth technique was intermittent kindness. Captors who had been brutal might suddenly show kindness, offering food, reducing workload, treating the captive almost gently. This unpredictability prevented captives from developing stable coping strategies, kept them focused on reading their captors' moods, rather than on their own internal states, and created psychological bonds that made resistance more difficult. Modern psychologists recognize these techniques as methods that produce what is now called traumatic bonding, the psychological attachment that develops between captives and captives under conditions of fear, isolation, and intermittent kindness. The Apache did not know the neurological mechanisms involved, but they understood empirically that these methods worked. The breaking process was not uniform across all captives. Children, particularly young children, were often treated more gently. The goal was adoption and integration rather than breaking. Women of marriageable age received treatment calibrated to their expected role as wives. Older captives, whose integration was less likely, might receive harsher treatment appropriate to their status as permanent slaves. But across all variations, the fundamental purpose was the same: to destroy the captive's previous identity and create someone capable of functioning within Apache society, in whatever role had been assigned. Let me tell you now about 5 women whose experiences in Apache, or related captivity, were documented well enough to reconstruct their stories, women whose outcomes reveal the range of what captivity produced. Olive's story is the best documented because she lived to tell it. After her release in 1856, she eventually cooperated with a minister named Royal Stratton to produce a captivity narrative that was published in 1857 and became one of the most widely read accounts of southwestern captivity. The narrative presents Olive's experience through the lens of 19th-century expectations, emphasizing her suffering, her resistance, her maintenance of Christian faith despite pagan captivity. But even through this filter, details emerge that reveal the reality of her experience. The tattoos on her face were permanent markers of her captivity. Mojave women received similar tattoos as part of normal cultural practice, but Olive's tattoos specifically identified her as a captive, someone who had been taken, transformed, incorporated into Mojave society through processes that left visible evidence. She would carry these marks for the remaining 47 years of her life, unable to hide her history regardless of how she tried to present herself. Her reintegration into white society was difficult. She had spent 5 years living as Mojave, speaking Mojave language, following Mojave customs, surviving according to Mojave ways. The person who returned was not the 15-year-old who had been taken. She was someone else, someone shaped by experiences that her rescuers could not understand and that she struggled to explain. She married in 1865, had no children, lived quietly in Texas until her death in 1903 at age 65. Her husband reportedly destroyed most of her personal papers after her death, leaving questions about her internal experience of captivity and return that can never be answered. What the sources do reveal is that she never fully reconciled her captive experience with her post-captivity life. She gave lectures about her experience for several years, but eventually withdrew from public speaking. She maintained contact with the Mojave people, or at least did not sever all connection. When she died, she carried her tattoos to her grave, permanent evidence of a transformation that neither captivity nor return had been able to complete. Sarah Ann Horn was captured in Texas in 1836 during a Comanche raid that killed her husband and several children. She spent approximately 2 years in captivity before being ransomed, and she later dictated a narrative of her experiences that provides some of the most detailed description of the early stages of southwestern captivity. Her narrative emphasizes the initial shock of capture and the physical brutality of the early period. I was seized while trying to reach my children. I saw my husband killed before my eyes. I saw my older children scattered. I did not know then and would not know for years which of them lived and which died. I was bound, thrown across a horse, and carried away from everything I had known with a speed that made thought impossible. The breaking process she describes is consistent with other accounts. She was worked to exhaustion, denied adequate food and water, beaten for any resistance, isolated from other captives when possible. She describes the psychological impact in terms that suggest the dissociation that modern trauma researchers recognize. There came a point when I no longer felt that the body being beaten was mine. I watched from somewhere outside myself as they struck me. I watched as my hands performed the tasks they demanded. I was present and I was absent at the same time. I think this separation is what allowed me to survive. I could endure what was happening to the body because I was no longer entirely in it. Sarah Ann was eventually ransomed. Her family raised money to purchase her release, a common outcome for captives whose relatives had resources and knew where to direct them. She returned to Texas, remarried, had additional children, and lived until 1891. But her narrative indicates that return did not end the effects of captivity. She describes nightmares that continued for years, a fear of certain sounds and situations that reminded her of her captivity, difficulties in relationships that she attributed to what she had experienced. Modern readers recognize these as symptoms of what is now called post-traumatic stress effects that 19th-century medicine did not understand and could not treat. Larsina Pennington was 18 years old when she was captured in Arizona Territory in 1860 during an Apache raid that killed several members of her party. Her experience was relatively brief. She was held for approximately 1 month before being recovered by military forces pursuing the raiding party. But her account provides detailed description of the intensive breaking that occurred during the early period of captivity. She describes being stripped immediately after capture. They took everything, my clothing, my shoes, my belongings. I was left with nothing from my previous life, nothing that connected me to who I had been. They gave me a rough garment that barely covered me and moccasins that did not fit. I was no longer the person who had worn those clothes. I was becoming someone else. Someone they were making. The month she spent in captivity included intensive labor, physical punishment, and the beginning of the identity destruction process. She was given an Apache name, forbidden to speak English, required to perform tasks that demonstrated her submission to Apache authority. What makes Larsa's account distinctive is her description of resistance and its consequences. I refused at first. I would not answer to the name they gave me. I spoke English when I could. I prayed aloud in defiance of their commands. Each refusal brought punishment, beating, deprivation of food, isolation in conditions that I thought would kill me. I learned that my resistance changed nothing except the degree of my suffering. The tasks still had to be performed. The transformation was still happening. I was simply making it more painful for myself. By the time military forces recovered her, she had been significantly affected by even 1 month of captivity. She returned to white society, married John Page in 1863, and lived until 1913. But her accounts of captivity, recorded in various forms over her long life, indicate that the experience marked her permanently. Francesca Johnson was a Mexican woman captured by Lean Apache in approximately 1843. Her case is documented in military records and government correspondence rather than in a formal captivity narrative, providing a different type of evidence about captivity experience. She was approximately 22 years old when captured, the wife of a rancher whose property was raided during the endemic violence of the Texas-Mexico borderlands. Unlike some captives, she was not ransomed or rescued. She spent approximately 11 years in captivity before being recovered during a military campaign against Leon bands in 1854. The military records describe her condition at recovery in terms that suggest the comprehensive nature of her transformation. The woman calling herself Francesca Johnson was recovered among the Lipan camps. She speaks Apache fluently and Spanish with difficulty, apparently having lost facility with her native language during her years of captivity. She shows reluctance to leave the Apache band and had to be restrained during removal. She claims to have children among the Lipan whom she was unwilling to abandon. Her mental condition is assessed as confused. Her attachment to her captors apparently genuine, despite the conditions of her captivity. This description reveals something that many captivity accounts minimize: the genuine transformation that long-term captivity could produce. Francesca had spent 11 years among the Lipan. She had borne children with Lipan men, children who were in her experience her family. She had formed relationships, learned skills, built a life within the constraints of captivity. When rescue came, it meant being torn away from this life as violently as her original capture had torn her away from her Mexican existence. Her fate after recovery is unclear in the records. She was apparently returned to Mexican authorities, but whether she was reunited with any surviving original family, whether she adjusted to life outside captivity, whether she survived long after her second uprooting, these questions cannot be answered from available sources. Her story reveals the complexity that simple narratives of captivity and rescue often obscure. Captivity transformed people. That transformation was genuine. Return to original society was itself a form of trauma, a second uprooting that demanded another transformation that some captives could not make. The military records of Fort Buchanan, Arizona Territory contain references to a captive woman recovered in 1858, whose name was never recorded. The records identify her only as a white woman recovered from Apache captivity in severely impaired condition. The circumstances of her capture are not documented. The records indicate only that she had been held for several years, that she was recovered during a military engagement with a Chiricahua band, and that her condition at recovery was such that the military surgeon recommended she be confined for her own protection. The surgeon's notes provide clinical description. The woman is unable to give coherent account of her identity or origin. She responds to English speech, but does not produce intelligible English in return. She has numerous scars indicating past injury. Her behavior alternates between passivity and violent agitation without apparent cause. She cannot be left unattended without risk of self-harm or flight. Diagnosis: complete mental derangement resulting from prolonged captivity among savages. 19th century medicine had no framework for understanding what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress with dissociative features. The surgeons saw mental derangement, where modern psychology would see a trauma response. The complete psychological breakdown that some captives experienced when the breaking process exceeded their capacity to adapt. The records indicate that this woman was transferred to a facility in Santa Fe, New Mexico for continued confinement. What happened to her after this transfer is not documented. She appears in the historical record as a nameless case study, evidence that the captivity process could destroy minds as well as transform them. Her story is the dark counterpoint to the survival narratives that have received more attention. Olive Oatman survived and wrote a book. Sarah Ann Horn survived and dictated her experiences. Lena Page survived and lived into the 20th century. But some captives did not survive in any meaningful sense. Their minds broke under pressures that exceeded what human psychology could endure. The variation in captive treatment from the relatively mild experience of adoption to the severe treatment that produced complete psychological collapse was not random. It reflected the purposes that different captives were expected to serve. Captives intended for adoption, particularly young children, received treatment designed to facilitate genuine integration. They were taught skills included in community activities, treated in ways that encouraged attachment to their new families. The goal was to create someone who would function as a genuine community member, whose loyalty and attachment would be real rather than coerced. Captives intended for marriage received treatment calibrated to their expected role. They were broken enough to ensure compliance, but not so broken that they could not function as wives and mothers. They were taught the skills expected of Apache women. They were integrated into households where they would serve specific functions. Captives intended for labor or trade received harsher treatment. Their psychological well-being was less relevant to their function. They needed to work not to form attachments. The breaking process for these captives was more severe, the conditions of their existence more brutal. Captives who resisted persistently, who could not be broken through standard methods, who proved more trouble than they were worth, were killed or allowed to die. The investment required to break them exceeded their potential value. The system had no use for them. This functional variation explains the range of outcomes documented in captivity accounts. Some captives genuinely integrated into Apache society, forming attachments that survived even after rescue. Some captives survived by complying without attachment, performing required roles while maintaining internal resistance. Some captives broke completely, their minds unable to sustain the pressures applied to them. Some captives were killed when they proved unsuitable for any available function. The Apache captivity system was not designed to produce any single outcome. It was designed to sort captives into functional categories and process them appropriately for each category. The brutality was systematic, serving purposes that made sense within the cultural logic of Apache society, even when they made no sense to captives who did not understand that logic. The experiences of women in Apache captivity are documented in multiple categories of surviving evidence. Captivity narratives constitute the most detailed source. Women like Olive Oatman, Sarah Ann Horn, and others wrote or dictated accounts of their experiences that provide first-person description of what captivity involved. These narratives must be read critically. They were produced for 19th century audiences with specific expectations, and they were filtered through editorial processes that shaped their content, but they provide detail that no other source type matches. Military and government records provide a different category of evidence. Army reports, correspondence between officials, records of ransom negotiations, and captive recoveries document captivity from an external perspective. These sources lack the internal perspective of captivity narratives, but they provide information about scale, about treatment patterns, about outcomes that captivity narratives may not address. Anthropological studies conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries while Apache elders still remembered traditional practices, documented captive taking from the Apache perspective. These studies describe the cultural logic governing captive treatment, the stages of processing, the purposes that captives served, information that explains patterns visible in captivity narratives and military records. Archaeological evidence confirms aspects of what written sources describe. Excavations at Apache sites have uncovered evidence of captive presence, material culture of non-Apache origin, skeletal remains showing evidence of violent injury, spatial organizations suggesting the housing of captive populations distinct from community members. Physical evidence on survivors' bodies documented what written sources describe. Oatman's tattoos were photographed and can still be seen. Scars described in military reports and captivity narratives left permanent marks on bodies that could be examined and documented. These physical traces confirm that the experiences described were real. The weight of evidence makes Apache captivity one of the better documented captivity systems of the 19th century American frontier. What captives experienced is not speculation or legend. It is documented in sources that have been available to scholars for over a century. The return of captives from Apache captivity was not the end of their ordeal. Returned captives faced challenges of reintegration that many found as difficult as captivity itself. The physical markers of captivity, tattoos, scars, physical damage could not be hidden. Returned captives bore visible evidence of their experience that marked them as different, that invited questions and judgments that many found painful. Olive Oatman's chin tattoos drew stares wherever she went for the rest of her life. The psychological effects of captivity persisted long after return. Captives had been transformed by their experiences in ways that did not simply reverse when they re-entered white society. They had learned to function within Apache cultural frameworks, had developed relationships and attachments within that framework, had become someone other than who they had been. Return demanded another transformation, becoming again something like who they had been before, or becoming something new that could function in white society. The social reception of returned captives was often ambivalent. 19th century society valorized returned captives as survivors and victims, while simultaneously regarding them with suspicion. What had happened to them during captivity? Had they been violated? Had they formed improper attachments to their captors? Had they in some sense gone native, become something other than properly white? These questions shaped how returned captives were received and treated. Some returned captives integrated successfully. They married, had families, lived what appeared to be normal lives. But the accounts that survive suggest that even apparently successful integration often masked ongoing struggles, nightmares, difficulties with intimacy, psychological wounds that never fully healed. Some returned captives never integrated. They remained psychologically trapped in their captivity experiences, unable to function effectively in white society. Some were institutionalized. Some died in circumstances suggesting suicide or self-neglect. Some disappeared from historical records in ways that suggest fates too grim to document. Some returned captives maintained connections to their captive experience in ways that white society found disturbing. They missed aspects of life among their captors. They maintained relationships with former captors when possible. They acknowledged that their captive identity had become, in some sense, as real as their original identity. This acknowledgement was rarely welcome. White society wanted returned captives to be grateful for rescue, not ambivalent about return. Apache captivity must be understood within the broader context of violence on the 19th century American frontier. The Apache peoples were themselves targets of violence, military campaigns, massacres, forced relocations, the destruction of their traditional way of life. Captive taking was one element of a conflict in which both sides committed atrocities, in which civilian populations on both sides suffered, in which the total casualties reached into the tens of thousands over decades of warfare. American and Mexican responses to Apache raids included practices as brutal as anything the Apache did. Scout bounties encouraged the killing of Apache people for cash payments. Military campaigns targeted not just warriors but entire communities, killing women and children alongside fighting men. Captive Apache people were themselves enslaved, sold, killed, treated with brutality that matched or exceeded what Apache captives did to their prisoners. This context does not excuse what happened to women in Apache captivity. Their suffering was real. Their experiences were traumatic. Their stories deserve to be told. But context helps explain why the violence occurred, why it took the forms it did, why both sides developed practices that seem incomprehensible outside the framework of total conflict that characterized the Apache Wars. The women who were captured existed at the intersection of this conflict. Victims of Apache violence. That was itself a response to American violence. That was itself a response to indigenous resistance to invasion of indigenous lands. Their individual suffering was real. The larger context that produced their suffering was a tragedy of collision between peoples who could not coexist in the forms their cultures had taken. For Marianne Oatman, who was 17 years old when the attack came, who watched her family destroyed before her eyes, who lay dying in the Arizona sand, while her sisters were taken into captivity, who died alone in the desert without anyone to mark her grave. For Olive Oatman, who was 15 years old when she was captured, who survived 5 years of captivity through adaptation that transformed her into something her family would not have recognized, who carried the tattoos of her captivity on her face for the remaining 47 years of her life, who never fully reconciled the person she had been with, the person captivity made her. For Marianne Oatman, the younger, who was 7 years old when she was captured, who was traded to the Mojave and raised in circumstances that approached adoption, who died during the famine of 1855 at approximately 11 years of age, her young body, unable to survive the deprivation that killed many Moavis well. For Sarah Ann Horn, who saw her husband and children killed, who endured 2 years of captivity before being ransomed, who returned to white society, carrying psychological wounds that continued to affect her until her death over 50 years later. For Larsena Pennington Page, who resisted and was beaten, who submitted and was transformed, who recovered after only 1 month of captivity, but carried the experience for the remaining 53 years of her life. For Francesca Johnson, who spent 11 years in captivity and bore children among the Lipan, who formed attachments that made her rescue another form of uprooting, whose fate after recovery disappeared from the historical record. For the unnamed woman of Fort Buchanan, whose mind broke under pressures that exceeded what her psychology could endure, who was confined to institutions for whatever remained of her life, who appears in history only as a case study in the destruction that captivity could cause. For the hundreds of other women taken during the Apache Wars, the story is even harder to tell. Women whose names were never recorded, women whose lives were not preserved in journals or memoirs, women whose experiences survive only in fragments, buried in military reports, government correspondence, and second-hand accounts written by people who never lived what they described. They were not adventurers. They were not participants in the American frontier by choice. They were caught inside a conflict they did not create, subjected to systems they did not understand, and reshaped by experiences far beyond anything their previous lives had prepared them for. Their suffering was real, their transformation was real, and their stories deserve to be told without the romantic distortions that have long shaped frontier history. Some survived. Some did not. Some were forced to integrate into captive societies, where they resisted until resistance was no longer possible, or until something inside them finally broke. Some returned to white society and managed to adapt. Others struggled for the rest of their lives. Some never truly returned at all. Every outcome represents a real woman's experience of captivity and its aftermath. This is what women endured in Apache captivity. This is what the sources document: the taking, the breaking, the transformation that captivity was meant to produce. This is what survivors described in their own words, filtered through 19th century expectations and language, but still revealing the brutal reality beneath. The frontier wars ended more than a century ago. The Apache peoples survive, their traditional ways reshaped by reservation life and the pressures of forced assimilation. The captive women are all long gone. Their voices remain only in documents most people will never read: military reports detailing recovered captives, government agents negotiating ransoms, captivity narratives written by women struggling to describe trauma in terms their society would accept. But the experiences were real. The suffering was real. The transformation was real. And here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we believe those stories matter. They deserve to be remembered not as romantic figures in frontier mythology, not as symbols in arguments about civilization and savagery, not as footnotes in someone else's narrative. They deserve to be remembered as people, as women who endured something most of us cannot imagine, as survivors whose survival demanded a price few humans are ever asked to pay.